first celebrities.
I would say that 90% of the female population in the country was madly in love with him, and the other 10% was crazy.
When the aviation legend married Anne Morrow, they were the most glamorous pair, adored by the public.
There was this beautiful couple, this prince and princess.
And the birth of Lindbergh's baby became a national celebration. But being in the spotlight had its dark side. The Lindberghs were hunted by an insatiable press.
I mean, this is the beginning of the paparazzi.
Everybody thinks that they want to be famous, but it's a tremendous burden for someone like my father.
And celebrity would have an unthinkable consequence.
But he froze right in front of his wife, and he looked her in the eyes, and he said, "Anne, they've taken our baby."
It was the crime of the century, and the biggest manhunt the country had ever seen.
Any information of any kind should be forwarded directly to me, Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf.
The trial would transfix the nation. And their loss could never be replaced. But there was still something else that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Now, Peter Jennings with Stolen in the Night.
Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne built their dream house here in rural New Jersey in late 1931. It was going to be the place where they could be safe. But it never became their home. And tonight you'll understand why. Good evening. When Charles Lindbergh made his fearless solo flight across the Atlantic to Paris, he exemplified, among other things, an age of American optimism. And the country's interest in its young hero only grew with his marriage to the very lovely Anne Morrow. By the time their first child was born a year later, America's first couple had become so besieged by the press that this house was going to be their sanctuary. And then their child was kidnapped here. Tonight we'll see how this crime affected the Lindberghs and how they lived through the tragedy of a child stolen in the night. On May the 22nd, 1927, when Charles Lindbergh landed his tiny Spirit of St. Louis on a dark field at Le Bourget Airport outside Paris, he had no idea the furor his solo flight across the Atlantic had caused. In the darkness, 150,000 people were waiting to greet him. "33 hours earlier, when he had taken off from a muddy runway in New York to battle sleeplessness and stormy weather across the Atlantic, Lindbergh's aim was simply to make aviation history. But when he succeeded in making the first solo flight across the Atlantic, this 26-year-old became in an instant the foremost celebrity of the 20th century.
Well, we had movie stars before who were chased to some degree, but even movie stars were protected by their studios. And the way he behaved in that moment, I think, is what makes Charles Lindbergh truly interesting. How he chose to live the rest of his life.
Everybody thinks that they want to be famous, but it's a tremendous burden for someone like my father. And this fame, this phenomenon, which did many things to him, most of them terrible. This fame was a quantity he couldn't control in any way.
In the months that followed his history-making flight, Lindbergh tried to oblige an insatiable public. He appeared in more than 100 parades. He visited 48 states. He was seen in person by an estimated 2 out of every 3 Americans. By the end, he was bone-tired. But then the new ambassador to Mexico suggested that Lindbergh make a goodwill visit south of the border. Ambassador Dwight Morrow had been Lindbergh's advisor since his triumphant return. Now he needed his young protege's help, bolstering America's dismal relations with Mexico. Indeed, the Mexicans were thrilled. And so were 3 young Americans. Dwight Morrow's daughters were visiting for the Christmas holidays. Now the man tagged as the world's most eligible bachelor would be staying with them.
Elizabeth was extremely beautiful, fine-featured, and very graceful. And then there was a younger sister, Constance, who was zippy and fearless and had wonderful sense of humor. And there was Anne, who was more introverted than the other two girls, very self-conscious.
My father seemed so astonished at this family with the three sisters and this very feminine atmosphere. They found it very charming, his lack of sophistication.
Lindbergh was so inexperienced with the opposite sex, his mother had gone to college with him, that he'd never been to a dance or on a date. There was no shortage of women eager to become Mrs. Lindbergh. During 1927 alone, he got 10,000 letters proposing marriage.
I would say that 90% of the female population in the country was madly in love with him, and the other 10% was crazy.
I think everybody, kind of hoped he'd single them out of some room they were in with him and say, I want you for my bride.
But Lindbergh wanted to marry a woman who came from what he referred to as good stock. The Morrows certainly qualified.
I think that he certainly, initially at least, regarded the Morrow sisters as if they were thoroughbred horses.
They were in Mexico at that time, and I think if you were reading the newspapers, it was inferred that he was interested in Elizabeth.
Elizabeth had a great sense of her social value, and I think she thought, how could Lindbergh fall for any Morrow daughter but me? Anne, however, was scared to death that she would be seated next to Lindbergh at some meal, because, my God, what kind of conversation could I possibly make with Charles Lindbergh?
Anne was not surprised when it was Elizabeth who Lindbergh made plans to see the following summer, but she wrote in her diary that she was very disappointed.
This was just more than she could bear, that her sister, this bright and beautiful young woman, had gotten the man that Anne so desperately wanted.
By the fall, Anne was resigned to reports that Lindbergh and Elizabeth had secretly become engaged. And so it was a shock when, out of the blue, Lindbergh phoned her.
And he said he wanted to speak to Miss Morrow, and the servants assumed he wanted to speak to Elizabeth, but he said, oh, no, Anne Morrow. And she got on the phone, and they stammered out a conversation, and Lindbergh sort of suggested, I think I promised you a plane trip when we all got back to America, and would you like to go flying?
I don't think she felt there was much hope of seeing him again when she left Mexico. So then when he called her up and said, wouldn't she come flying, she was surprised and totally pleased.
And on only their second date, Lindbergh proposed marriage. Anne accepted.
I think the real pull, the real magnetism between these two young people was that element of great shyness. Each of them shared that. Neither had a sense of how attractive he or she was. And I think that was extremely powerful. And I think that was at the root of their relationship.
In the weeks that followed, however, Anne worried about how well suited they really were.
The Morrows had a lot of servants, lived in a very formal manner. Lindbergh did not find this comfortable at all. He liked to talk to the servants, and befriend them. You weren't supposed to do that.
I think in the time between Charles's proposal and their actual wedding date, I think Anne Morrow asked herself a million questions. She was extremely sophisticated in her education and in her reading. She had read the great books of the past and of the present, and I think she wondered what kind of intellectual conversations would they be having for the rest of their lives.
In the end, Anne decided that if she didn't marry Lindbergh, she would miss out on a life of adventure and possibly end up the wife of a diplomat or a banker. Her parents, on the other hand, were less than delighted by Lindbergh.
Although Dwight Morrow had sort of taken up Lindbergh in a big way and sort of saw him as a surrogate son, when it came to the idea that he was going to marry his daughter, that was a different thing.
I think he was expecting that my mother would marry someone from her own group of people, someone highly educated, someone in the same social circle, etc. And he was kind of astonished.
Now suddenly Dwight Morrow was saying,